is a kind of power so complete that it stops feeling like power. It starts feeling like weather. You don't question the rain. You don't negotiate with it. You don't petition it or protest it or vote it out of office. You simply live beneath it, and you call that living free. The Rockefeller family did not build an empire in the way that word usually implies, with armies, with conquest, with visible force. They built something quieter than that, something that looks from the outside almost like generosity, almost like progress, almost like the natural order of things. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to look at directly. What most people don't realize is that the world you were born into, the price of the fuel in your car, the structure of the hospital where you or someone you love was treated, the university system that shaped how entire generations were taught to think, the international institutions that govern global health and development policy, all of it was touched in measurable and documented ways by a single family, not a government, not an elected body, not a democratic institution accountable to anyone, a family. And by the time you finish listening to this, you will understand something about power that most people spend their entire lives standing inside of without ever once looking up. The Rockefellers. The name carries a particular kind of weight, a particular quietness, as though simply saying it out loud requires a slightly lower voice, a slightly more careful posture. It is one of those names that functions almost like a geographical feature, like saying the Atlantic or the Alps. Something that simply exists, has always existed, and will presumably continue to exist regardless of what any individual person thinks or does about it. By the time John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, he had accumulated a personal fortune estimated at $900 million, which by most serious modern calculations translates to somewhere between $20 and $25 billion in today's terms. Though some economists who study wealth concentration argue the real equivalent is considerably higher when you account for the proportional share of the national economy he controlled at his peak. But even that number is misleading, because the influence that fortune purchased never converted back into simple currency. It didn't sit in a vault. It moved. It grew. It changed forms. It became institutions, foundations, universities, hospitals, policy frameworks, and international organizations. It became, in the most literal sense, the world. And the world, as worlds tend to do, forgot who built it. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman who operated under the false identity of Dr. William Livingston and made his living selling fraudulent cancer cures and herbal remedies from a wagon to rural communities that had no other access to medical care and no way to verify his credentials. Historical records confirm that William was a bigamist. He maintained two entirely separate families in different states simultaneously, moving between them for years without either family's knowledge. He was charming, persuasive, theatrical, and completely unmoored from conventional morality. He once reportedly told a friend, with apparent pride, that he cheated his sons whenever he got a chance, because it sharpened them. He believed that deception, practiced early and often, was a form of education. This is where John D. Rockefeller came from. Not from wealth, not from privilege, not from a tradition of institutional power, from a household built on performance, on strategic concealment, on the foundational understanding that how things appear and how things are can be two entirely different things, and that the man who controls the appearance controls the room. And then something happened that William Avery Rockefeller, con man and bigamist and self-styled doctor of nothing, could probably never have predicted. His son took everything that childhood had accidentally taught him: the discipline, the patience, the cold and unsentimental understanding that sentiment is a luxury, and he applied it not to fraud, but to oil. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil of Ohio. What followed over the next 12 years was not simply business success. It was not innovation in any conventional sense. It was the systematic, deliberate, and patient elimination of competition on a scale the United States had never encountered and was not yet equipped to understand. Rockefeller negotiated secret rebate agreements with the major railroad companies of the era, arrangements through which Standard Oil paid dramatically lower shipping rates than any of its competitors, rates that were not publicly disclosed, rates that made it structurally impossible for a rival refinery to compete on price, regardless of how efficiently it operated or how good its product was. He used the savings generated by those secret rates to undercut competitor prices in local markets, selling below cost if necessary, for as long as necessary, until the rival either sold out to Standard Oil at Rockefeller's price or collapsed entirely. When they sold, he was gracious. When they collapsed, he bought the wreckage. Either way, he absorbed them. That word, absorbed, appears again and again in the historical testimony and contemporary accounts of this period. Not defeated, not outcompeted, not driven out of business, absorbed, as though Standard Oil were not a corporation but a biological process, and the American oil industry was simply material passing through it. One rival refiner, after being pressured into selling his business at a price he had not chosen and on terms he had not negotiated, told investigators that the experience felt less like a business transaction and more like being informed of a decision that had already been made. He said that sitting across from Rockefeller's representatives was the only time in his professional life that he genuinely could not identify a moment at which refusal remained a real option. He sold. Everyone eventually sold, or collapsed. By 1882, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. 90%. One company, one man's vision, translated through a network of trusts and subsidiary corporations into a structure so complex that even federal investigators initially struggled to map its full extent. The United States government would later describe Standard Oil as the most dangerous monopoly in American history. And what is important to understand is that this was not hyperbole, and it was not political rhetoric. It was an accurate description of what had happened to an entire sector of the national economy. Towns that depended on oil for heating, for lighting, for industrial production, had no meaningful choice about where they purchased it. Independent refiners who'd built their businesses from nothing found themselves operating in a market that had been structurally redesigned to make their survival impossible. Railroad companies that tried to resist Rockefeller's pressure for preferential rates found themselves facing retaliatory tactics sophisticated enough that some historians of antitrust law still use them as case studies today. What Rockefeller had built was not a company in any ordinary sense. It was a system that, once fully operational, required no further acts of overt aggression, because it had removed the conditions under which resistance was viable. And through all of it, every documented act of economic destruction, every eliminated competitor, every secret agreement and suppressed wage and dangerous working condition, John D. Rockefeller kept meticulous personal ledgers in which he recorded with evident satisfaction his charitable giving. He had tithed from his very first paycheck as a teenager, Sanita giving 10% of his modest income to his church before he had any real income to speak of. He taught Sunday school. He prayed before meals and credited God with apparent sincerity for every business success. He believed genuinely, without visible contradiction, that God had granted him the specific capacity to accumulate wealth, and that this capacity was therefore a form of divine assignment, a calling, a responsibility. What this meant in the architecture of his psychology was that there was no internal mechanism to stop him. Every acquisition, every eliminated rival, every act of economic consolidation was not merely permitted by his belief system. It was, in his own framework, sanctioned, required, perhaps even holy. And that is not a horror story invented for dramatic effect. That is a documented psychological reality recorded in his own words, in his own handwriting, across decades of personal correspondence and financial ledgers that historians have studied in detail. Workers in Standard Oil facilities during the period of the company's peak dominance labored in conditions that federal investigators and journalist Ida Tarbell, whose 1904 investigative series in McClure's magazine remains one of the most consequential pieces of journalism in American history, described in detail. Long hours, suppressed wages, dangerous machinery, industrial accidents absorbed into operating costs without meaningful compensation to the families of the dead. The men who physically built this empire, who breathed the fumes, who maintained the equipment, who lived in company towns where the rent and the store prices were also controlled by the same entity that controlled their wages, were considered, in the coldest actuarial sense of the word, inputs, variables in an equation whose output was wealth and whose human cost was simply a line on a balance sheet. This was not unusual for the industrial era. What was unusual was the scale and the sophistication and the completeness of the control. And the smile. Contemporary accounts of Rockefeller in person consistently describe a man who was warm, quiet, patient, who genuinely seemed to enjoy the company of ordinary people, who handed out dimes to children he encountered on the street, a habit so thoroughly documented it became almost mythological, reproduced in cartoons and newspaper columns and decades of public memory. That image, the kind old man and his dimes, existed simultaneously and without apparent tension alongside the economic reality of what he had built. And somehow, in the collective memory of the American public, the dimes won. For decades, the dimes won. Now we need to talk about Colorado, because Colorado is where the story stops being abstract. On April 20th, 1914, in Ludlow, Colorado, members of the Colorado National Guard and company guards employed by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, an enterprise owned by the Rockefeller family, opened fire on a tent colony of striking coal miners and their families. The background is this. Workers at Colorado Fuel and Iron had gone on strike in September of 1913, demanding union recognition, enforcement of existing Colorado labor laws that the company was openly violating, payment in U.S. currency, instead of company scrip redeemable only at company stores, and the right to live in housing not owned and controlled by their employer. The company responded by evicting striking workers from company-owned housing, forcing them and their families to relocate to tent colonies on public land. The strike had been ongoing for 7 months when on that April morning, the National Guard moved on the Ludlow colony. What followed lasted approximately 14 hours. Guards and soldiers fired into the tent colony. The tents were set on fire. When investigators and journalists arrived the following day, they found the burned remnants of the camp, and beneath one of the burned tents, in a pit that families had dug beneath the floor as a refuge from the bullets, they found the bodies of 2 women and 11 children. They had suffocated in the pit while the tent above them burned. In total, at least 21 people died at Ludlow on April 20th, 1914. The actual number may have been higher. Investigations were complicated by the fact that the company and the state government were not entirely separable entities in Colorado at this time. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who managed the family's Colorado operations, was called before a congressional committee to testify. He stated clearly and on the record that he would rather see the strike continue indefinitely at whatever cost than recognize the union. He described his position as a matter of principle. The principle being that the right to determine the conditions under which labor was performed belonged to the company and not to the workers. 21 people, including 11 children, died in defense of that principle. Not as a regrettable accident, not as a tragedy that resulted from a momentary loss of control, but as a consequence of a sustained policy of resistance that the Rockefeller family's representatives chose to maintain over 7 months of escalating conflict when alternatives were available. This is not an allegation. This is the record of the congressional testimony available in the National Archives, available to anyone who wishes to spend an afternoon reading it. What happened next is, in some ways, the most instructive part of the entire story, because it did not end the Rockefeller dynasty. It did not result in criminal prosecution. It did not produce a meaningful shift in the family's political or economic power. What it produced was a publicist, John D. Rockefeller Jr. Hired Ivy Lee, one of the founding practitioners of what we now call public relations, to manage the family's image in the aftermath of Ludlow. Lee advised the younger Rockefeller to visit the Colorado mines personally, to be photographed with workers, to speak publicly about his concern for their well-being, to distribute press releases that reframed the events at Ludlow as the result of union agitation rather than company policy. He coached Rockefeller on body language, on tone, on the specific vocabulary of empathy. It worked. It worked with a thoroughness and a speed that should, by any reasonable measure, be more disturbing than the massacre itself. Because what it demonstrated was that in an industrialized media environment, with sufficient resources and sufficient sophistication, the narrative of an event can be separated from the event. The story of what happened and the story that most people carry about what happened can be made to point in entirely different directions. Within a decade of Ludlow, the Rockefeller name had been substantially rehabilitated in American public opinion. John D. Rockefeller Jr. would go on to be celebrated as a great philanthropist and a champion of worker welfare. The children in the pit would be remembered by historians and largely forgotten by everyone else. and the modern corporate public relations industry, the entire global apparatus of managed perception that every major corporation, every government, and every powerful institution now employs as a matter of routine, was built, in significant part, from the lessons learned in the effort to recover from Ludlow. The machinery that makes power look benevolent was constructed, at least partially, right here, in the wreckage of a burned tent colony in southern Colorado. Here is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to hold in your mind as a single coherent thing, because the Rockefellers did not only destroy, they also built. The University of Chicago, founded in 1890 with a foundational gift from John D. Rockefeller, became one of the world's great centers of research and intellectual life. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, funded public health initiatives that saved millions of lives. A hookworm eradication campaign in the American South that dramatically reduced rates of chronic illness in poor rural communities. Foundational research into yellow fever that led to the development of an effective vaccine. Agricultural development programs in Latin America and Asia. During the mid-20th century, the historians of food security credit with preventing famine on a scale that would otherwise have been catastrophic. These are real. These are not rhetorical devices. These are documented outcomes of documented programs funded by documented money. They are not nothing. They are, in some cases, genuinely extraordinary. But here's the question that history keeps asking and never fully resolves. When a private family, accountable to no electorate, subject to no democratic oversight, required to justify its priorities to no one outside its own boardroom, funds the infrastructure of public health, of higher education, of international agricultural and development policy, who is actually making the decisions about what gets built and what doesn't? Who decides which diseases get researched and which don't? Which universities receive endowments and which operate without resources? Which countries receive agricultural assistance and on what terms? The Rockefeller Foundation operated for decades as one of the most consequential policy-shaping entities in the world, making decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people across dozens of countries. And it did so without any mechanism by which the people whose lives were being shaped could weigh in on whether they agreed with the priorities. It did enormous good. It also accumulated, in the process of doing that good, a form of influence over global systems that no election had ever granted, that no democratic process had ever sanctioned, and that no election could ever remove. And the fact that the intentions behind it were largely benevolent, and they appear in most documented cases to have been, does not fully resolve the question of what it means for private wealth to be the author of public institutions. The land beneath the United Nations headquarters in New York City was donated by the Rockefeller family in 1946. John D. Rockefeller Jr. provided $8.5 million to purchase the 18-acre site on Manhattan's East Side. This is recorded history. This is not a disputed claim. The institution designed to represent the collective sovereignty of every nation on earth, the body created to embody the principle that no private interest should override the public good of humanity, was built on a foundation provided by a private family. You can draw from that whatever conclusion feels appropriate to you. But it is worth sitting with. It is worth letting that fact exist in your mind without immediately resolving it in either direction, because the discomfort of holding it without resolution is precisely the discomfort that honest engagement with power tends to produce. The Rockefeller family in its fifth and sixth generations today maintains influence through a network of foundations, investment vehicles, family offices, and institutional board memberships that is genuinely difficult to map in its entirety. Rockefeller Capital Management oversees billions in assets. The Rockefeller Foundation continues to operate as a major force in global health and development policy. Family members maintain positions on the boards of cultural, academic, and policy institutions across multiple continents. And the Rockefeller Brothers Fund shapes philanthropic strategy on issues ranging from climate change to democratic governance. None of this is particularly hidden. Most of it is publicly disclosed. You can look most of it up. And in some ways, that transparency makes it more unsettling rather than less, because the question is no longer whether the influence exists. It visibly and openly does. The question is whether any of us in the daily texture of our ordinary lives actually feel it, whether we feel it in the curriculum that shaped our understanding of economics and history, whether we feel it in the medical research priorities that determined which treatments exist and which don't, whether we feel it in the international institutions that structure the options available to developing nations seeking assistance. We almost certainly don't feel it. We were not designed to. The architecture of this kind of influence is specifically constructed to be invisible at the level of individual experience. You feel the effects. You simply don't feel the hand. What most people don't realize is that the truly comprehensive form of power is not the kind that forces you to do things. That kind of power is always visible, always brittle, always subject to resistance, because resistance has something to push against. The truly comprehensive form of power is the kind that shapes the available options before you ever begin choosing. It builds the school and writes the curriculum. It funds the research and thereby determines what knowledge exists to be discovered. It endows the institution and thereby shapes what questions that institution considers legitimate to ask. It constructs the menu, and then it steps back and allows you to feel entirely free in your selection. That kind of power does not need enforcers. It does not need surveillance. It does not need secrets, because the most important things it has done were done in public, recorded in foundation annual reports, and university naming rights and congressional testimony and newspaper archives, visible to anyone who looks, safe in the knowledge that most people never will. It simply needs time and patience and the quiet, generational understanding that if you build enough of the world, you never need to control anyone directly, because the world itself will do it. The world you built, inhabited by people who have never known any other world, people who experience its structures as natural rather than constructed, as given rather than chosen, as weather rather than architecture. John D. Rockefeller, the man who absorbed 90% of American oil refining, who outmaneuvered the federal government for decades, who survived the Ludlow massacre and congressional investigations and 2 world wars, and the complete dissolution of his monopoly by court order, and still died one of the wealthiest private individuals on earth, lived to the age of 97. In his final years, he continued the habit of his entire adult life, handing out dimes to strangers on the street wherever he went. By that point in his life, he had given away over $500 million, billions in today's terms, through systematic, organized philanthropy. He attended church until he was physically unable to do so. He maintained the ledgers. He said his prayers. He gave out the dimes. The same man who built a system that suffocated an entire industry. The same man whose company's guards were present at Ludlow. The same man who told Congress he would let the strike continue forever rather than recognize the workers' right to organize. The same man, the same dimes, the same quiet, warm, utterly unreadable smile. We are very good, as a civilization, at remembering the dimes. We are considerably less skilled at remembering what paid for them. We are least skilled of all at asking whether that distinction matters. And here is the final unsettling truth that this story leaves behind, not as an allegation, not as a conspiracy, but simply as a fact lying in plain sight. The systems this family built, the philanthropic frameworks, the institutional structures, the model of private wealth shaping public goods, did not end with the Rockefellers. They became the template. Every major tech billionaire who establishes a foundation, every hedge fund manager who endows a university building, every corporation that funds medical research and thereby influences which medical questions get asked. They are all, in ways that are historically traceable and institutionally documented, operating within a model that was pioneered here. The Rockefeller approach to power did not belong to the Rockefellers. It belonged to anyone with enough wealth to apply it. And in the century since John D. Rockefeller first demonstrated how thoroughly private capital could reshape public life, the number of people with enough wealth to apply it has grown considerably. The weather, in other words, is still being made. The architects are simply newer, the buildings are shinier, the dimes are larger, and most of us are still standing in the rain, looking up, wondering why the sky looks the way it does. You will go back to your life after this. You will fill your tank and visit your doctor and perhaps watch your children learn things in schools built by money older than they can imagine. You will operate inside systems so thoroughly constructed by accumulated private will that the walls became invisible long before you were born. And that is almost certainly fine. That is, in all probability, how it will continue. But somewhere, in a quiet room, in a well-funded building, with a name on it that you recognize without knowing why, someone is making a decision. It will reach you eventually. It may have already. And the most unsettling thing, the thing that stays with you after everything else fades, is not that you didn't know. It's that the system works best precisely because you didn't. Just like everyone before you. All the way back to the beginning. All the way back to a man in a wagon in upstate New York, selling cures for diseases he couldn't treat to people who had no way of knowing the difference. It runs in the family.